Beijing calls on Washington to resolve the Korean Peninsula issue by diplomatic means. US President Donald Trump asks for a review of China's trade practices. And the White House is on the defense again after the US president fails to denounce white supremacists. We'll discuss it all. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. It's been a difficult period for US President Donald Trump. That's putting it mildly. He's been facing challenges both internationally and at home. On Monday, Trump put the focus squarely on Beijing. He asked his trade office to consider investigating China for alleged theft of American technology and intellectual property. Beijing said any action on trade protectionism will harm relations between the two countries. To discuss all of this, here in the studio is Afshin Molavi. He's a senior fellow with the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Also with us is Ray Baker. He's a journalist and political analyst here in Washington, D.C. And Lester Munson is a vice president with the BGR Group, a strategic consulting firm. And also joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a political analyst with China Radio International. Okay, let's start with the trade situation, the trade war between the United States and China. Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. President Trump has asked his trade office, as I said, to investigate alleged theft of American technology, of intellectual property, American intellectual property. Let's listen to what the president had to say.
We will stand up to any country that unlawfully forces American companies to transfer their valuable technology as a condition of market access. We will combat the counterfeiting and piracy that destroys American jobs. We will enforce the rules of fair and reciprocal trade that form the foundation of responsible commerce. And we will protect forgotten Americans who have been left behind by a global trade system that has failed to look, and I mean look, out for their interests.
So, Qinduo, what's been the response from China to those sentiments expressed by the U.S. leader?
Okay, I think the response from Beijing is quite a measured one. And firstly, obviously, there's a genuine concern that the U.S. will rely on unilateral approach by using domestic laws, such as Section 301 of the Trade Pact, basically, to punish its trading partners like China. Because that not only means like a trade war, but also the abandoning probably of this WTO, World Trade Organization, multilateral trading system internationally. So that's a concern from the Chinese side. And also, of course, Chinese official response also includes like if there's a trade war, if there's punitive measures against the Chinese entities, Chinese companies, the Chinese side will not sit there and do nothing. Obviously, they will retaliate with appropriate measures against the U.S. interests. So that's basically the response officially from China.
Qinduo, before we get on to the other issues, one more issue on trade, and that is China has promised to open more of its industries to foreign companies. It made that promise just a few weeks ago. Is that happening? What happened to that proposal?
Yes, if you look at China-U.S. trade, we know there is a deal not long ago, well, not a huge deal, but China agrees to buy U.S. beef and also natural gas. And also Chinese market will be open up to the U.S. rating agencies and the credit card companies. And more recently, China agreed to buy rice from the United States. And also, if you look at China as a whole, since 2013, actually, there is such a project called Free Trade Zones, started in Shanghai a few years ago. And then the practice was expanded to 11 provinces and cities in China. One key element to that free trade zone is the so-called negative list. That means like, the negative list basically will state clearly in which sectors foreign investment is restricted. Otherwise, basically you have the freedom to do investment. I think China, from its own experience of joining WTO 15, 16 years ago, China benefits hugely from such a trading system. So China is clear and remaining open In a sense, like, openness is the strength of the Chinese, because there's in general, there's a consensus among the Chinese society and also the government. If you look at 100 years ago, China was basically defeated by many countries. That's because many people attributed that situation to the closeness of the nation at the time, at the end of Qing dynasty. So keep this country open is basically the consensus of the nation. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, basically that's an opening system, basically opening to every country in the world.
Okay, Lester, getting back to what we heard the President say just a few moments ago on that piece of tape. I mean, those were tough words, fighting talk, some might call it. Is the President looking to pick a fight here with China?
You know, I think his rhetoric, it does sound tough, but the actual steps that the administration are taking are actually pretty modest. He's asked some of his officials to take a look at whether there should be a report on these issues. He hasn't actually called for sanctions. He hasn't actually called for penalties. This is way preliminary to any of those kind of steps. There's other interesting things happening on the trade front. Congress itself is looking at other ways to restrain some of the trade between the U.S. and China. They're in particular looking at limits on Chinese investments in sensitive U.S. technologies over national security grounds. So there's a lot of complicated maneuvers going on right now on the trade front, both from the administration, from the Chinese side, and from the U.S. Congress. So I think there's a lot to take a look at here. And I wouldn't jump to any immediate conclusions that this is necessarily going towards a trade war, but there's clearly a resorting out of the economic relationship between China and the United States.
Afshin, what do you make of it? It seems to be mixed messages, mixed signals the President is sending out, because not so long ago we heard about the wonderful dinner he had with President Xi Jinping at his golf resort in Florida. Now we get this.
Now we get this. You know, for those who do want a trade war with China, be careful what you wish for. I mean, you know, China is the third largest export destination of U.S. exports after Canada and Mexico. I mean, something like 8 or 9% of all U.S. exports go to China. Soybean farmers are worried when they hear Donald Trump say things like this. Aircraft manufacturers, what we're about to see is an extraordinary growth in aircraft purchases from China, and companies like Boeing could benefit from that. So be careful what you wish for when it comes to a trade war with China.
Ray, to what extent is this politics? It seems the President finds China to be a very convenient punch bag when he wants to satisfy his base. He talks about China being responsible for, well, there is a big deficit between the two countries, but China's also responsible for taking away American jobs, for taking away American industries. Is this all about politics?
It is very much, and I'm glad that the two gentlemen with me already have documented how the policy and the effects of trade are actually going to manifest themselves. But we cannot divorce this from what's happening here in the United States homeland. It's important for your viewers to know that President Trump has a 34% approval rating. President Bill Clinton never got below 35%. President Barack Obama never got below 35%. President George Bush only got to 35% when he was in the midst of 2006 of the Iraq War. So what this means, President Trump is doing what we would simply call playing the hits, the things that made him remarkably popular amongst the audience that supports him. So if he says, in our clip, we remember him saying specifically the millions and millions of people who were left behind and who lost their jobs because of this. So when he speaks those words, those folks hear him saying he's going to go to bat for us despite the myriad of other problems he has governing the United States.
But he's president now. He won the election. Does he still have to play the hits?
We have the evidence that he seems to be in consistent campaign mode despite having already won the election. And so as he continues to find himself in various troubles, whether we're talking about incidences with foreign policy, with conversation about North Korea, whether we're talking about incidences here on the homeland in Charlottesville, once he finds himself in that particular type of quagmire, he goes back to the talking points that have made him wildly popular during the campaign.
Okay, let's move on to the nuclear tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Qinduo, I'm going to get back to you. China has again called on the United States to resolve these tensions with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea through diplomatic means, through negotiations. How concerned is China over the terminology that we've been hearing recently from the United States? We've been hearing about fire and fury. What was the other one that came out? It was, we are locked and ready.
Well, China is not reacting dramatically to that tough rhetoric, but I think there's a real concern from the Chinese government and also the Chinese society, because China is one of the immediate neighbors of North Korea. If there's a war, China will become one of the few countries that will be affected the most. So with this tough rhetoric, we are used to tough rhetoric from North Korean side. So everybody is used to that. There's no big deal. But then tough rhetoric from President Trump, that's something new. And also remember, not long ago, a US general has said that if President Trump ordered him to launch a nuclear attack against China, and he will do that. With all the tough rhetoric from President Trump, we can see here people feel there's a, somehow we are getting closer to a real war on the Korean Peninsula. So that's obviously quite less dangerous, dangerous road toward, if you look forward there. And China is concerned, and that's why China is calling for, again, the solution to this problem is only diplomatic means, negotiation dialogue, not tough rhetoric or talk of war. Frankly speaking, the talk of war is threatening, is dangerous, even for us to talk about a scenario of war on the Korean Peninsula is dangerous.
So, Lester, on the one hand, we have President Trump using this fiery language, the rhetoric that he comes out with. On the other hand, we do have people in the administration like Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, the Defense Secretary James Mattis, who wrote a piece, they co-wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, which they say, yes, negotiations, diplomacy is the way out. But they do make the point that the onus is on China to push this process forward. What is the United States looking for China to do?
Well, let's review a little bit. Not only has the rhetoric been tough, but also the actions taken by North Korea have stepped up over time rather dramatically. You've got intercontinental ballistic missile capability for the North Koreans. It's now clear they can miniaturize nuclear explosive devices. The threat is much more real than it's ever been. And the regime in Pyongyang, which is virtually wholly dependent on the good graces of China, has threatened to launch missiles over Japan towards Guam, saying they'll land just outside the territorial waters there of the United States, which, and by the way, I'm not sure they're that accurate, so you wonder where they're going to actually land should they be fired. So this is not just provocative, that's essentially threatening war. So while President Trump's rhetoric was pretty tough and escalatory, it was not nearly matching what Pyongyang itself had been doing. And to say, as the previous guest said, that it's okay because North Korea always kind of talks this way is I think, not a good thing to say. And we should recognize that the situation, because of North Korean actions, has become much more difficult. And what I'd look for, in addition to the diplomacy, is it's critical that we see Washington and Beijing get together and have a common policy towards North Korea. This can't be done with tit-for-tat claims against each other and different attacks on these two big superpowers. There has to be a collaborative effort to resolve the questions on the Korean Peninsula, and I hope that's what we see quickly.
And Afshin, what would the solution look like? I mean, we hear all this talk coming out of the United States. We hear equal kind of bluster coming out of North Korea, the DPRK as well. Is this going to deter the DPRK? Are they going to say, okay, then we'll dismantle our nuclear weapons?
I think we're past that point, Anand. I don't think North Korea is going to dismantle their nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un has proven that he can survive, and the regime in North Korea has proven that they can survive without much care or regard for the welfare of their people for a long time. So as long as, the elite are taken care of, that they will survive. I think where we are right now, Anand, is South Korea, Japan, China, the big Asian powers really need to come together here because the real threat is to them. Seoul is within 40 miles of these missiles, and I would like to see all of them come together along with the United States to sit down with North Korea. But I think we've passed the point of no return on North Korea's nuclear weapons.
Ray, to what extent was this a crisis actually made in the United States? Because there's some very smart people around who say, look, Kim Jong-un looked around, he saw what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Libya, and his insurance policy is a nuclear arsenal.
Well, absolutely, that's first, right? There's the argument to be made in many of those places that the United States was moving in a way that undermined the will of the people there, and there can be conversations to be had, I'm not interested in having them now, as to whether there was legitimate will of those who were elected there. But what we see specifically, and I'm glad you referenced Seoul, because that's 40 miles away, and that's collateral damage that the United States has such a vital ally. Obviously, the United States is an ally to China, but particularly to Seoul, given our influence and our participation with the Korean conflict in the 1950s, it would be incredibly irresponsible of us, incredibly irresponsible to try to get into some sort of a conflict where Kim Jong-un can then take out actions there because that's where the closest place to hit the United States. And so I think there is a degree of crisis and conflict made here in the United States with this. And I'd also like to draw your viewers' attention to this. James Mad Dog Mattis, a man who in combat has the nickname Mad Dog, has been the voice of reason. And so again, I bring this back to the political stylings of our president, President Trump, because war in a place like the United States that is so nationalistic, that is so, some would argue, jingoistic, right, is a place that's always a good selling point. And again, to repeat myself, is playing the hits.
And I'd also, you referenced Libya. I'd also kind of throw out there the notion that in 2003, after the U.S. went into Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi voluntarily gave up his nuclear capability to the United States, voluntarily. And a few years later, the Obama administration went in and took him out. That actually has to be on the mind of folks in Pyongyang and elsewhere, that just because you give up your nuclear weapons doesn't necessarily mean the big superpower on the globe is going to be okay with you later on. That's actually, I think that's an excellent point to bring up.
Right, and the other thing that was very interesting about what you said, Afshin, is there was a guest on the show here last week who said something. He says, you know, we hear all kind of alarm bells ringing in Washington, other capitals around the world, but we should really get worried when the supermarket shelves in Seoul start being emptied.
That's right.
And we're not seeing any of that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, and the leadership in Seoul still believes that diplomacy is the answer. And you know, in many ways, they need to be taking more of a leadership role in all of this.
Okay. Qinduo, one other thing, that China has expressed concern over the deployment of the anti-missile system, the U.S. system called THAAD, in South Korea. What is China's main concern? And do you think that THAAD system is going to be part of some ultimate broad negotiation between the Koreas as well as China and the United States?
Well, for China, you know, the deployment of the THAAD system, well, on the surface, of course, it's a defensive purpose. Basically, that will protect South Korea or the U.S. troops in South Korea from missile attack from North Korea. But also remember that the THAAD system can also be used to collect information or intelligence gathering, not only from North Korea, but also from China, mostly northern part of China. So there is a possible compromise of Chinese defensive or offensive ability on the Chinese side. So that's the concern. That's why China is strongly opposed to the deployment of THAAD system. There's also concern with the deployment in South Korea and also possible deployment in Japan and also possibly in the future, like Taiwan. That would be like a new defense line along the east coast of China. So somehow, you know, China's military ability will be largely restrained by the THAAD system. And so that's why Beijing is deeply concerned with the THAAD system. At the same time, the THAAD system, you know, is really up to the South Korean government. President Moon has talked about, you know, any military action has to get the consent of Seoul, of South Korea. But then at the same time, they are supporting the deployment of the THAAD system and also joining the U.S. for large-scale military exercise, which is perceived by North Korea as a threat. You know, what China is calling for is like the suspicion or pause of this, or reduction of the scale of the military exercise on the South Korean side to treat for the suspicion of nuclear development on the North Korean side. You know, that kind of a treating system would create some environment for dialogue, for diplomacy. You know, at the end of the day, if you want to solve this problem, probably you have to go through diplomatic means. You have to study, sit at the negotiation table, give and take, and give some compromise and get what you want in order to have peace and stability prevail in this region.
Lester, one proposal which has been bandied around here in the United States is that, well, it goes like this. The DPRK is not going to dismantle its nuclear weapons. It's going to be there, that's it. You're going to have to accept that. And that's what the United States and its allies are going to have to do. Accept that it is now a nuclear power and then adopt a policy of some kind of deterrence.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen. The current, the status quo right now is hugely beneficial to Beijing. And it's not beneficial to Washington and its allies. I don't see the United States and South Korea and Japan and others with an interest in this being willing to accept a nuclear-armed North Korea, particularly one that behaves the way this regime does. It's simply not acceptable. So these tensions are not going to go away. There's a natural logic to them. I think earlier the comment was made that by deploying a missile defense system, you'd actually constrain the ability of China to act militarily in the region. That may be exactly the point of deploying a missile defense system, and it should be deployed. And I kind of wonder why the Trump administration was trying to bill the South Koreans for it, which is another interesting question. But I don't think it's going to go away that easily. There's a natural tension here. And at the end of the day, what has to happen is for the United States and China to have a common approach. And both countries need to realize that settling down the tensions on the Korean Peninsula are in both their interests. And I think right now, more of the burden is on Beijing to get North Korea to act in a more responsible manner.